Good evening, everybody. I'm Reverend Wendy Von Zuccolo, and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Marblehead, where we're hosting this event. And my job is really easy. It's just to give you a great big welcome, to introduce you to tonight's moderator. Our moderator is the former Globe columnist, the host of MHTV's Changing Our World, and a treasured hot ticket member of this congregation. She didn't write that part.
This year, Tom noticed that we had interviewed 5 people who had traveled to the Middle East with peace on their mind. And Tom came up with the idea for this panel, which is based on 5 people who have had first-hand experience of the Middle East. And it was that we were interested in, not ideology. Our criteria was, these 5 people are local, they've been on our show, they met with Palestinians as well as with Israelis, and they all sincerely want peace in the Middle East. I have to say, I don't know what they're going to say. We haven't pre-screened, cleared, or limited any of their pronouncements. But I do believe something that I read a long time ago, and it's sort of been the basis of everything I've written since. First-hand experience is as transfusible as blood. Isn't that interesting that you don't have to live everything yourself? If you find someone who's been through it and they tell you, you can learn just as much. And so we're lucky that the 5 panelists tonight are going to give us a first-hand peek at what they learned from their visit. The structure of the meeting tonight will involve a 10-minute uninterrupted presentation by each member, although in the 11th minute, you'll hear a little click, and that will be, please finish up, okay? And those presentations will be followed by a question and answer period. There are cards right here, Bill has them with pencils. If you have a question, please indicate if it's for a specific member, otherwise just leave it blank, and then I will give the panel a chance to respond to them. Most of us know where we stand on this issue already. Every person I've ever met has convictions, opinions, and beliefs that they hold passionately. That's what makes us so interesting as human beings. But I hope tonight you will leave a little room. If you could just squeeze them together so that there's a little room for you to take in the new perspectives that are going to be presented here this evening. We want this to be a learning experience, even though for those who have thought long and hard about these issues. And we hope that you all come with an open heart and mind that are willing to allow new insights and new information to be taken in. It goes without saying, no booing, no clapping, no shout-outs from the audience. We'll get a chance to vote by phone following this program in 5 minutes. Anybody watch Dancing with the Stars? We will begin in alphabetical order with the Reverend Dennis Calhoun. Since 2007, Dennis has been a senior minister of Old North Congregational Church. There's a little known fact here that both Dennis and Rabbi Meyer were born and raised in Kansas. Along with Dorothy, the only other person I know from Kansas. Dennis serves on the Massachusetts United Church of Christ Commission for Ecumenism and Interfaith Dialogue. He has a long history of interfaith activism and work on peace and justice issues. He visited Israel and the West Bank for the first time last February, along with 34 members from Old North and Temple Emmanuel who went together, and he's going to have a sabbatical in 2013 when he can rest up, and he hopes to return to Israel then.
Thanks for restart the clock. Thanks for your introduction, and thanks for your invitation to be here. As a Christian clergyman, I believe that as a disciple of Jesus of Nazareth, I'm called to be, among other things, a peacemaker. So I'm here this evening because I believe that grassroots gatherings like this can help increase understanding and build the trust that's necessary to wage peace. I want to begin my remarks by admitting I have no expert knowledge regarding the origins and the history of the current conflict between the State of Israel and the Palestinian people, nor am I particularly well informed about the long and as of yet unsuccessful political peace process that's been underway for as long as I can remember. What I hope to bring into the conversation this evening is just a very brief sketch of a few Christian perspectives on the situation and some quick thoughts about how we've contributed to the conflict, but might also help contribute to the resolution of it. Simply put, Christian attitudes towards both Jews and Muslims and toward the modern state of Israel have helped fuel the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but could, I believe, also help address it. Whichever of the many narratives one hears regarding the conflict, whether from a Jewish perspective or an Arab perspective, whether it begins with the rise of political Zionism in the 19th century, or the dislocation of Palestinian Arabs that started after the Balfour Declaration in 1917, whether it considers the turning point to be the birth of the secular state of Israel in 1948, or the occupation of the Palestinian territory after the Six-Day War in 1967, whether it centers on the quest for security within internationally recognized borders, or the recognition of basic human rights and the restoration of an ancestral homeland. Whichever of the many narratives one hears regarding the conflict, Christians have always played a role, typically a quite significant role, although one that has frequently been obscured by both history and current events. As a Christian, I need to name the role we've played and to continue to play in the conflict we helped create. To begin with, we need to acknowledge how Christian theology and religious attitudes towards Jews have heightened anti-Semitism since very near the beginning of Christian history. Two themes in traditional Christian theology, deicide and supersessionism, have contributed to the persecution of Jews since the 4th century of the Common Era. Deicide is the claim that the Jews are responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus. Supersessionism is the claim that the Old Covenant of Israel has been replaced and that redemption is through Christ alone. Since the Holocaust, many Christians have acknowledged how these two doctrines have been the cause of anti-Semitism, and they've searched for ways to repudiate theological tenets that foster contempt for Jews. Now, while it's a good thing for Christians to repent for our role in the oppression of the Jewish people, an unintended consequence of our collective guilty conscience has been to suppress some of the hard questions that we might otherwise raise in a healthy exploration of political Zionism. Simply put, because many Christians are justifiably ashamed of the ways our attitudes have led to unspeakable sufferings among the Jewish people, we've been hesitant to voice our concerns regarding the policies and actions of the modern state of Israel, which have led to the suffering of many of the Palestinian people. As one Jewish theologian, Mark Ellis, has put it, first there was the crime against the Jews, and now there is the crime against the Palestinians. And once again, as our grandparents did in the 1930s and 40s, many Christians have remained silent. Fortunately, as difficult as it's been to foster an open conversation on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in American religious circles, there's been some progress, partly due to an opening of conversations at the grassroots levels. Again, this is why I'm happy to be a part of this forum this evening. We are talking, and that is a start. I'll quickly mention another attitude held by many Christians, but also by many Jews, that creates or contributes to the conflict, and that's the conflation between the modern state of Israel and the biblical people of Israel. This has led to what is, in my opinion, a particularly dangerous political theology referred to as Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism is a predominantly American movement among evangelical and fundamentalist Christians that sees the modern state of Israel as the catalyst for the end of times, the fulfillment of biblical apocalyptic prophecy, culminating in the return of Jesus in an act of final judgment in which unbelievers will be violently destroyed. Christian Zionism has become a significant political force in the United States. According to public polls, it's woven deeply into the American social and religious fabric. The state of Israel is a fulfillment of the biblical prophecy. There are those who say that religious belief is private, a private matter that doesn't need to have political consequences. But that is patently naive in the American Christian. Distort Christian theology by omitting the command of Jesus to love our enemies and seek peace based on justice. It also fails to see Jews and Muslims as real people, reducing them to actors in a primarily Christian religious drama. Since my time is running short, I'll end by saying that as an American Christian clergyman, I'm dismayed by the reluctance of many of my ministerial colleagues to lean into the challenge of discussing the enormously complicated and emotion-laden question of a solution to this long-standing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Passions run high in what's often less of a debate than an ideological and verbal brawl. If forced to say what they see as a way forward, most of my colleagues are willing to say what the majority of Israeli Jews and Arabs have been saying for years, that they support a two-state solution in which Jews are assured security and non-Jews are assured self-determination and universally accepted human rights. Unfortunately, many of my Christian colleagues just leave it at that. Or they hold up their voting cards at the periodic meetings of their denominational gatherings and urge the adoption of resolutions drafted by others that simultaneously denounce and commend one side or the other without seriously considering the implications of their proclamations on the real people who are living in the midst of the conflict. Don't misunderstand. I believe there is a place for the official pronouncements of religious bodies, providing they're well-reasoned and unbiased to the degree that's possible. In the same way, even though the various initiatives undertaken as part of the political peace process have failed to broker a lasting peace, the effort must continue with renewed imagination and resolve. But while the politicians and the religious leaders are doing what they do, I'm convinced that I too have a role to play as the pastor of a Christian congregation here on the North Shore of Boston. My role, a modest one to be sure, but an important one, is to do all I can to foster understanding, model reconciliation, and advocate a nonviolent resolution to a conflict halfway across the globe in a land that at least half the world's people call holy. Thank you.
Thank you. Now you have to give the same exact number of claps. Dr. Evan Longin will go next. He's a professor of graduate counseling and psychology at Salem State University, and he also serves on the faculty of the Peace Studies Institute there. He's co-founder and a director of the Salem Center, which trains counselors in a new method of treating patients called dialogic therapy. Is that correct?
That's correct.
He has worked with Debbie Nathan, who is here, the founder of the Artsbridge Institute, which brings young Israelis and Palestinians to the Boston area every summer, where through the use of art and dialogue, they come to understand each other's personal narratives. And I personally have seen the friendship that springs up when I've gone to their art shows at the end of the summer, and the wonderful work that both Debbie and Evan are doing. Evan has visited both Israel and Palestine 4 times in the last few years, training native teachers how to use the techniques he has developed for helping one person understand another's perspective. Evan?
Hello. I have a hard time following Dennis. He's quite eloquent. And my remarks tonight are more informal. I have had the great honor and privilege to work with Artsbridge these last 4 years. Debbie once was an intern of mine. She studied in our office. She was an expressive therapist student at Lesley College, and then she came to me and she said she had this idea, and I said she was nuts. That she was going to go work with people in the Middle East using our techniques. And she eventually convinced me to be nuts with her. and go on this journey. And it has been an incredible honor to be participating in this. My passion, the passion that I've developed over the past 4 years working with Debbie, is the idea that we can actually bring people together with very disparate narratives about each other and begin to help them learn about one another and work together. And it has been a remarkable experience. One of the things that I want to share with you tonight is the most powerful idea that I've come away from my trips to the Middle East with is the number of mis- and disinformation each community has about the other. And it's quite impressive that both these people are cousins, descended from two brothers. And you go into their homes, the homes of Palestinian families, or the homes of Jewish families, and they're eating the same meals. They're behaving in the same way. They look alike, they smell alike. They're clearly much more akin to one another than different from one another. And yet, each side has these ideas that they express about the other as being so dangerous and so hostile. Debbie and I just ran a seminar on the West Bank 3 weeks ago in a community named Bet Jala, which is outside of Bethlehem. And one of the things that was so painful to us is about half of our Jewish participants did not arrive. They became fearful and thought it was too dangerous to come to the center that we were holding this seminar. And when I talked to the Palestinian participants, they have such contempt for the Jewish people, who they see as being oppressors and hurtful. And so both sides are so incredibly entrenched in these stories that they deeply hold about one another. Yet when we bring them together, when ArtsBridge brings these young people together, or when we train counselors from both sides, what they start to hear is the commonality of their experience, the commonality of their hurt, the commonality of their fears, the commonality of their pains. And they start to understand each other as people who hold so much in common and so much hope in common. You know, one of the things that is so palpable on both sides is that both sides love Eretz Yisrael. Both sides express, we in one seminar were listening to the two groups, Palestinian and Israeli, talking about their love of this land, their sense of belonging to this land. And when they hear that about each other, they all of a sudden realize maybe there is something we can do together to share in this process. Recently, also Debbie and I went to an ALSMEP meeting. ALMEP meeting. It's the Alliance for Middle East Peace. And it's the NGOs that are working in the area all together. And the speaker at the meeting was a fellow named Gershon Baskin. And the interesting thing that he was telling us was that he, behind the scenes, had just arranged for the release of the Israeli prisoner. And this happened on an informal basis. What happened was he was actually speaking at a conference in London when a Palestinian psychologist called him and said, "We have got to figure out a way to get this prisoner out of Gaza, because if he gets killed in Gaza, my people will become destroyed by the Israeli invasion that will take place." And he wasn't concerned about the Israeli prisoner, he was concerned about the Palestinians in Gaza. But Gershon began a process 2 years ago of working with this Palestinian professor. And behind the scenes, over time, over 2 years, they started to find connections between themselves and politicians who could help them, and ultimately brought about the release of Eli Shalit and 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. Now, I'm telling you this story because what it says to me is we are the people who are going to make the peace. That we as a community, through our informal connections, through talking to one another, through collaboration with each other, are the force that's going to bring about peace over time. It's not coming from the governments. The governments are not doing what's necessary. They're too entrenched in their narratives. They're not bringing about what's necessary for peace to happen between the various groups. And again, I'm excited that at so many different levels now, I'm participating in that process. For Salem State, I just made connection with Beit Burrell College, a very similar institution in Israel. It's about 2/3 Jewish, 1/3 Palestinian. It's a working class college about the same size as Salem State. And we're going to try to develop exchanges between our students and students from Israel, both Palestine and Israeli. This is, again, another way that we're going to start to be part of this process, we here on the North Shore, in bringing about connections between people. So I'm hoping to go back in January with Debbie. We need about $6,000 to $10,000, so if anybody here wants to help us to go back there. We're supposed to be training guidance counselors, 100 guidance counselors in Ramallah. And it's a very exciting prospect for us. So again, thank you for listening to me, and thank you for letting me join all of you tonight.
I'll ask you one question. Did it feel dangerous in that area where you come from?
No, in fact, we stayed, help me, Talitha Kumi. Debbie speaks Hebrew, and Little Arabic, and I speak English. Talitha Kumi is a Christian school and retreat center where we ran our seminar. And there were people from all over Europe, in particular, who were staying there, who were going through as pilgrims to the Holy Land. So in fact, it felt very safe. One evening, we went out to a bar in Beit Jala after our seminar. And we're sitting there, and people are smoking hookahs, and the people in the community were so welcoming to us. That's the thing we have noticed everywhere we go. We went to a school in the town of al-Faham, which is a Palestinian community. We went to the only Muslim private school in Israel, and it happens to be the highest ranked school in the country of Israel. And the interesting thing is that we were so welcome. We went into the classroom. We were told, people said to me, you don't want to go to al-Faham. It's a pretty nasty place. It's a place where people are very passionate in their resistance to Israel. The students applauded us. And again, it was an idea that somebody had come to listen to them. Somebody had come who cared, that they were given voice. So it's a very exciting opportunity.
Our next guest is Dr. Robert McNulty. He's the Director of Programs at the Center for Business Ethics at Bentley University. He's also the founder of a nonprofit organization which sponsors Pax Populi. I studied Latin in high school. That means peace of the people. It is a people-to-people peacemaking program focused on supporting the advancement of peace in Afghanistan. But in 2010, along with bringing over other foreign scholars, Bob brought 2 Israeli and 2 Palestinian professors to Bentley And in November, which was just days ago, he participated in a conference on the future of the Palestinian economy that was held at Hebrew University in the West Bank. Later this month, he's going to be a keynote speaker at a conference in Lahore, Pakistan, where he'll be speaking on the role of ethical business in advancing peace, which I think is really interesting. Bob?
Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin with a question. Whom do you support? The Israelis or the Palestinians? This question forms the explicit or implied background to much discourse on U.S. policy towards the Middle East. The question, I believe, expresses a dichotomy that is both false and pernicious. If we support only the Palestinians, we would in fact place in grave jeopardy the state of Israel, which is the indispensable homeland of the Jewish people, as well as the strongest democracy in the Middle East. However, if we support only Israel, we in fact undermine our support for Israel by failing to be seen as an honest broker who respects the human rights and dignities of all the people of the region. If there's going to be peace in the Middle East, it must include the Israelis and the Palestinians. There will be no Israeli peace without the Palestinians, nor any Palestinian peace without the Israelis. We are in this together. It is a regrettable fact of history that when the United Nations in 1947 arranged for the partitioning of Palestine in order to permit the formation of two countries for the Jewish and Palestinian peoples, no consensus or agreement was reached on how exactly to manage that partition. As a result, for over 6 decades, this problem has gone unresolved and remains the most important conflict facing the global community today. Let me briefly mention why I'm speaking to you on this panel. As mentioned by Ms. Weltner, I am the director of the programs at the Center for Business Ethics at Bentley University, and also the founder of the People-to-People Peacemaking Initiative called Pax Populi. At the Center for Business Ethics, my particular area of interest has been the role of business and education can play in advancing peace. This led me to invite 4 scholars, 2 Israelis and 2 Palestinians, to be our guests at Bentley University for a week in May 2010. During the course of our week together, we held frank but friendly and constructive discussions on what an envisioned Israeli-Palestinian peace might look like and what were the obstacles to it. All of our discussions were held in a spirit of sincere respect and friendliness. What surprised me was to see how much consensus there was between the two sides. Both the Israelis and the Palestinians were in agreement. The best way forward was to seek a 2-state solution, with the lands known as the West Bank and Gaza to constitute the territories of the Palestinian state, and most of the remaining land currently controlled by Israel to serve as their state. The difficult issues to be resolved were in 4 specific areas: exact borders, the status of Jerusalem, including East Jerusalem, the right of return of the Palestinian diaspora, and Israeli settlements in the West Bank. 3 weeks ago, I had the good fortune to participate in a conference on the future of the Palestinian economy that took place in Hebron University, which is situated in the largest city in the Palestinian territories. During my visit, I had the honor and pleasure of meeting with very well-informed Israelis and Palestinians, including the longtime former advisor to Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, the CEO of the Israeli-Palestinian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and several prominent Palestinian scholars and industrialists. I also got to do a fair amount of traveling in both the West Bank and in Israel, but despite my efforts, I was not permitted to visit Gaza, which I tried to do. I'm sorry to say that I returned from this trip less optimistic about the future peace process than when I arrived. The main reason for this is that despite the support for a 2-state solution professed by both sides, the solution necessitates that both states have their own territory. However, interspersed throughout the main Palestinian territories of the West Bank are highly developed Israeli settlements. Prior to my recent trip, when I heard the term settlements, I had imagined a few brave farmers out in remote areas similar to the American homesteaders. What I saw instead were gorgeous new suburbs that went on for many, many miles and were extremely well guarded by the Israeli Defense Forces. There's nothing in these settlements that conveys a sense of their being provisional. Not only that, but the Israeli government maintains a policy of settlement expansion and recently announced plans to forcibly relocate some 20 Bedouin communities in order to make room for new settlements. So if the two-state solution is not a viable option, then what is? The only other serious option is the one-state solution, in which the Israeli and Palestinian territories are merged into a single state. The main problem with this option is that the combined Israeli-Palestinian population, with the combined Israeli-Palestinian population, Palestinians would soon achieve demographic majority, and Israel would lose its character as a Jewish state. Moreover, if equal voting rights were recorded both Palestinians and Israelis of Jewish heritage, the Israelis of Jewish heritage would find themselves in a political minority as well. So although the current prospects for peace do not look that promising, the benefits of peace could be so great that my hopes have not been extinguished. First, despite the obstacles, the Israelis and Palestinians with whom I've spoken remain committed to the two-state solution as the best option. From the Israeli perspective, the indispensable requirement for peace is security. Based on my observation and from what I was told by both well-informed Palestinians and Israeli sources, the Palestinian Authority has done a good job in increasing security in the West Bank. And in so doing, they've taken concrete steps to show that they can be a good partner to Israel. Beyond this, the potential value for a constructive partnership between the Israelis and the Palestinians are enormous. Israel's accomplishments during its brief history as a nation are nothing short of extraordinary. The Palestinians, however, are widely admired as being among the most well-educated and industrious people in the Arab world. The Palestinians I have known are a pragmatic people, hungry for peace, who would welcome the possibility of working with the Israelis. Now, I know that that's not universally true, but I have met many, many Palestinians of that orientation. Together, Israelis and Palestinians could create a partnership that would be the envy not only of the Middle East, but the entire world. In doing so, the explosions of war could be replaced by explosive economic development, and with it would come a dramatic increase in security and the diffusion of the tension that emanates from this region. The situation is certainly complicated by the political control of Gaza by Hamas, an organization which is hostile to Israel. However, in my view, the greatest risk to peace is not Hamas, but simply maintaining the status quo. The current situation seems quite acceptable to many Israelis. They are not under attack, and their economy is strong. However, the relative stability masks a dire situation faced by most Palestinians. As one Palestinian said to me, "We don't have anything to lose because we have already lost everything." The status quo is not acceptable, not sustainable for the Palestinians. And while things are presently peaceful on the surface, the Palestinian territories are like a pot simmering on the back burner. At any moment, that pot could boil over. Change must come, and change will come. Will the nature of that change be peaceful? The answer to that question is in the hands of the Israelis and the Palestinians. However, the United States has a role to play. And to play that role well, we must be seen as honest and compassionate brokers who takes into account the needs of both the Israelis and the Palestinians. If there is to be any serious advance in the peace process, I think we would do well to change the discourse from whom do you support, implying one or the other, to what do you support? Because the Middle East peace will be a peace for both sides, not just one. And if we in the United States are sincere in our support for peace in the region, we would do well to put to the side inflammatory rhetoric and political theater. Instead, we must revive a sense of urgency to get both sides back to the table for serious negotiations aimed at achieving a peace that is just and lasting for the Israeli and Palestinian people. Thank you.
Rabbi David Meyer has been the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel since 1992. In 2006, he received the Leonard Pizekum Humanitarian Award from the Anti-Defamation League in recognition of his work building bridges of understanding between different faith communities. Last year, he and Reverend Calhoun jointly led an interfaith trip to Israel, and most recently, he was invited by the Palestinian Authority's Prime Minister to join 6 other North American rabbis and meet with leading Palestinian political and business leaders on a visit to Ramallah and the West Bank. He also went to Jerusalem and met with key Israeli political, military, and business leaders, and he's here to tell you what happened.
Thank you. Congratulations on these presentations. Why was I selected? A small group of North American rabbis representing a broad spectrum philosophically and religiously, because we were coming with no set agenda. And our agenda was to, much like tonight, open our minds and experience the realities on both sides of the separation scene in a way that very few groups do. Most come with an agenda or preconceived notions. And certainly I have, as a passionate supporter of the peace process and of Israel over the years, have my own ideas. But I want to share with you my impressions in a balanced way. And keeping in mind, as I think we've heard, that the end result of establishing a secure Palestinian state alongside the borders of Israel isn't just the official policy of the Netanyahu administration, it has been the official policy for many Israeli governments the past several. The two-state solution has been accepted as the most desired result and conclusion of the conflict. And over the past 2 years in the West Bank, though not in Gaza, under the bureaucratic leadership of Palestinian Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, my host, the infrastructure has been laid for the time when the state will come into existence, and without question, that's what's going to happen. The roads linking West Bank towns are quite good, built, by the way, mainly by Israel, in order to help the day-to-day travel needs of the Palestinians. But we don't really read about that sort of cooperation in the media very often. And in fact, the collaborative efforts between Israel and the Palestinian Authority security forces, as we've heard, are working rather well. Ramallah is poised to take on the role of economic capital of the Palestinian entity. In the downtown areas, there are new stone and glass government offices. Throughout the city, amidst the hodgepodge of older houses, apartments, and businesses, large and beautiful homes are being built, many with gorgeous views looking out across the hills and valleys. There's a stock exchange, a growing banking industry, a strong and successful police and security apparatus, and entertainment options, such as coffee shops and theaters springing up. There's even a home field for the soccer team just outside of Ramallah. So what are the barriers to peace? So much is already in place. What needs to be decided? For the most part, the issues remaining to be agreed upon are a little different than what you presented. Borders, refugees, security, and water. Now, one might think that since both sides want the same result, being Jewish and Palestinian sovereignty, those hurdles would be easy to overcome. But the Palestinians abandoned the negotiation process with Israel, deciding instead to take their case to the United Nations. Why? Well, it's important to note that not all of the Palestinian leadership was in agreement regarding the wisdom of their unilateral move towards declaration, including Prime Minister Fayyad, who publicly opposed it. But meanwhile, President Abbas and his spokesman described their decision to move forward at the UN as a step towards resuming the stalled peace process. They say that the United States has lost credibility as an objective mediator in the discussion, and so they're turning to the international community, of which Israel is a part, to allow greater input in solving some of the issues. The move, they say, is part of a wide-scale program of nonviolence resistance to the Israeli occupation, which they know in the court of world opinion will meet with great approval. The Israeli leadership, on the other hand, sees the Palestinian strategy of stopping negotiation, going to the United Nations, as a tactic to avoid negotiation, because in negotiation, there have to be concessions on both sides. But the deck is so stacked against Israel at the UN that whatever the Palestinians might present in the General Assembly will be passed. We saw that. So by avoiding direct negotiations with Israel to solve the outstanding issues, they won't have to give up anything. So in short, Israel is looking to negotiate toward the existence of a Palestinian state as a way of ending the conflict. The Palestinians are hoping to use Palestinian statehood as a platform of pressing on with their claims, continuing the conflict against the Jewish state. But there haven't been negotiations for 2 years of any substance. So what stands in the way? What do the two sides claim are the obstacles to negotiations? To the Palestinians, and they are of one mind and one voice here, the primary obstacle to negotiations and to peace is, in their words, quote, the continued illegal construction of Jewish settlements on Palestinian land. The Israelis respond with the fact that there have been no new settlements built for 10 years, and that when illegal settlers put one up, they're immediately and forcibly evicted by the Israeli army. And although there does continue to be some construction in the communities already established, such as hospitals and schools as children are born, last year the Netanyahu government imposed a complete 10-month-long freeze on all building projects in every community in the West Bank. And never during those months would the Palestinians return to the table. And I have to say, did not hear a satisfying answer from the leadership as to why not. The Israeli government insists that settlements aren't really an issue, and they use the Gaza Strip as proof of their contention. Since the Israelis left Gaza back in 2005, there are no settlements. There are no Israelis. It's Judenrein. There are no Jews. But that still hasn't stopped the forces of Hamas from launching an unending barrage of rockets from Gaza into towns inside of Israel proper. Israeli land is not even up for discussion. If settlements are the problem, Israeli leaders asked, then why is the territory where there are no settlements now controlled by a terrorist organization seeking to murder innocent civilians? Now, I should mention that the situation in Gaza and its control by Hamas is just as difficult a situation in some ways for the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank as it is for the Israeli government. I have to tell you, I'm confident, I don't think there's ever going to be a coming together, really, of Hamas and the PA, which of course begs the question, if we're going to define the nation of Palestine, who are we talking about? What are the borders? And I want to tell you the question I asked Ghassan Khatib, the director of the Government Media Center of the Palestinian Authority. Essentially, he's the international face of the Palestinians. And I don't mind admitting I was really nervous sitting next to him and asking the question. I'd just been in Ramallah for half an hour. And to paraphrase the prophet Amos, I am neither a diplomat nor the son of a diplomat. But I came there for a reason. I really wanted to know. And so I said, and I wanted to be respectful to my host, but here's what I said. Mr. Khatib, you and your government are clear and unified in your opinion that the primary obstacle to peace is the construction of settlement activities and communities in the West Bank. And he said yes. And I said, well, if I were to ask members of my community, they would tell me that the primary obstacle to peace is the refusal of the Palestinians to recognize the state of Israel as the rightful ancestral homeland of the Jewish people. Mr. Khatib, what would you have me say to my congregation? His answer was direct, but it wasn't really satisfying. Essentially, he insisted that the language of mutual recognition that had already been agreed upon in the Oslo Accords, and so such a demand was only being made to placate the Israeli right-wing coalition partners. You don't need that, he said, because you can make peace with Egypt without that language. You make peace with Jordan without that language. It's a new condition, Ghassan said, and it's one that doesn't help in the process. But the Israelis answer that the nature and the matter of Jewishness of Israel is important. And in fact, it's critical. Because when the problem of the Palestinian refugees is addressed, how can there be a Palestinian and a Jewish state if the descendants of the Palestinian refugees have a right to live in the Jewish, not the Palestinian nation. In fact, the essential Jewishness of Israel continues to be avoided by the Palestinian leadership. In September at the UN, Mr. Abbas spoke of the Holy Land as the place of the ascension of the Prophet Muhammad and the birthplace of Jesus Christ. But he failed to mention the fact that the Jewish nation had been settled there for more than 2,000 years before either Jesus or Muhammad, and that Jerusalem was the capital of Israel under King David and King Solomon. In fact, there continues to be a complete denial by the Palestinians of any Jewish claim to Israel. And I don't think there's the political will or strength in the PA leadership to go there. So I may have come away likewise with a sense of Avdat tikvatenu, our hope is lost. That's what the prophet Ezekiel said. But the Israeli national anthem says, Od lo, not yet. Our hope is not yet lost. And why? I also met with Avi Nudelman, the CEO of the Israel-Palestinian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, who's working together with Mohammed Abu Ain, chairman of the Palestinian Import-Export Association. They're creating partnerships and business connections between Israeli and Palestinian markets, and they're beginning to mark their successes, contributed now to nearly $2 billion in trade annually between the two sides. We were invited to the offices of Jerusalem Venture Partners, where startup companies and incubator projects and artistic enterprises are provided seed capital for development. And because of Israeli success in innovation, they are much desired investments. They're now working to develop a high-tech park in the city of Bethlehem and are working to partner with Palestinian incubator projects throughout the West Bank. I had coffee in downtown Ramallah with a woman named Huda Al-Jaq, the owner of a new chain of coffee shops. She's an entrepreneur and venture capitalist and is modeling her business after similar successful chains in Israel. I sat in the sparkling offices of the Director General of Quds Bank, one of the largest banking houses in the Palestinian lands. The former minister of the PA, he now runs a consulting firm in Gaza. And he spoke firsthand of the strong link between a healthy economy and the reduction in violence. And I traveled to the planned city of Rawabi, an $825 million development that is the largest project ever undertaken in the Palestinian areas. Among the funding sources are not just Arab nations, such as Qatar, but also Jewish and Israeli investors, including Michael Steinhardt, one of the founders of Birthright Israel. Upon completion, Rawabi will house some 40,000 young, middle-income Palestinians with state-of-the-art technological, environmental, and social infrastructure. Our group was taken to the highest point of the planned city. And from those heights where picnic tables and volleyball courts and a reception hall already stand, you can actually make out the buildings of Tel Aviv. You can see the Mediterranean Sea. And one member of our group made the comment of how easy it might be to fire a rocket from that spot right into the heart of the city. But of course, that's the last thing the people and the investors and the builders of Rawabi would want. There's too much at stake. There's a lot of money to be made. And what seemed consistent among all these business leaders and entrepreneurs was how they refused to get stuck in the narratives of victimization. They understand the challenges they face, but they're creatively looking for solutions. They're eagerly looking to the possibilities of the future. And so in conclusion, I have to tell you, I made my way back to Israel through the Kalandia checkpoint to Jerusalem. And it struck me that on both sides of the separation barrier, for example, the hundreds of thousands of protesters who filled the streets and parks in Israel last summer, much in the way of Occupy Wall Street has done now in this country, demanding social and economic justice and opportunity. And on the other side, the owners and workers in Palestinian businesses and communities, they're all looking for the same thing, the chance to make a better life for themselves and their children. Now, we should recognize the Palestinian conflict is not the only problem facing, and I don't think it's the biggest threat in the region. Not in the time of Iran's nuclear development, the growing anarchy in many Arab societies, civil war in Syria, a shifting of power throughout the whole region, but finding a solution to the conflict which would assure the mutual security for Israel and a Palestinian state would be an absolutely monumental and vital step. maybe that solution can be found over coffee in one of Huda's new cafe. There's one opening in Jerusalem next year.
Our last speaker, Susan Nicholson, has been a former philosophy professor at Chatham College in Pittsburgh, and she retired in 2008 after 25 years as a health law attorney at Ropes and Gray. In late 2009, she visited Israel and the West Bank, and last year she spent the fall semester in Beirut, Lebanon, studying the history and development of the Arab-Israeli conflict, taught by a Lebanese Christian at the American University of Beirut, Lebanon. She is an active member of the North Shore Coalition for Peace and Justice. Susan Nicholson.
Thank you. I visited Israel and the West Bank excuse me, in late 2009 on a study tour organized by Seville, which is a Palestinian Christian organization. We visited many of the biblical sites that would be typical in any tour of special biblical places of interest to people who are on a Christian tour. But we also made a special effort to go to places in the West Bank where we could observe firsthand the relations between Israelis and Palestinians. The single feature that struck me most forcibly on my 2-week trip was the wall, or separation barrier, that Israel has built in the West Bank. Most of my remarks will focus on the wall because I think it is of symbolic as well as concrete relevance to the entire conflict, really quite pivotal. The wall in Bethlehem, and I left some pictures of it, some slides that I had taken on the table outside, is a structure of heavy concrete slabs, 26 feet high, interspersed with military watchtowers of even greater height, placed in the middle of what was once a thriving commercial center of Bethlehem. I appreciate Rabbi Meyer's insight in a paper that he wrote about his trip. He left that out of today's talk, but where he said that he had the insight that the wall didn't just keep them out, but it also kept them in. I'd like to share my insight that the wall also keeps them apart. That is, keeps Palestinians apart from each other, from their schools, from their livelihoods, from their own fields. And that's because of where the wall has been built. The wall is not built primarily along the green line that separates the state of Israel from the West Bank, but rather in many places the wall is built well inside the West Bank. To remind you, the green line is just the armistice line drawn between Israeli and Arab forces at the conclusion of the 48 War, and which Israel crossed later in 1967 when it conquered the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. For example, the wall in Bethlehem intrudes 1¼ miles into the city of Bethlehem. And as our group learned in a UN briefing, when the wall is completed, it will cut off 12% of the land of the county of Bethlehem. That 12% will be placed on the Israeli side of the wall, even though none of the 12% is on the Israeli side of the green line. And on the Israeli side of the wall, it will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for most Palestinians to access that land. You can tell that the wall doesn't follow the green line because when it's completed, it will be twice as long as the green line. And 85% of it will be inside the West Bank and outside the green line. Another example of how the wall keeps Palestinians apart, in this case from their own land, comes from Belin, a Palestinian village I visited in the West Bank. Over 6 years, villagers have held demonstrations, one of which I attended. Together with 100 or so Palestinians, Israelis, and international peace activists, I marched from the village to the barrier and back. I saw no violence on the part of the marchers, not even stone throwing. Another form of nonviolent opposition utilized by the villagers is legal action. With help of an Israeli civil rights lawyer, Belin villagers challenged the in an Israeli court. The court interestingly made two conclusions. First, that the purpose of the barrier was to protect the Israeli settlement of Modi'in Elite and its planned expansion. And second, that the harm done to the villagers by the barrier was severe. Weighing the benefit against the harm, the court ruled that it was okay to build the barrier to protect this existing settlement of Modi'in Elite, but not okay to build it to protect the planned expansion. Therefore, the court ordered that the barrier be moved closer to the Israeli settlement of Modi'in Elite and further away from the village of Belin. And that meant that the village would get back part, although not all of its land. Well, 4 years passed, the villagers continued their weekly demonstrations, and finally, just this summer, the barrier was rerouted and the demonstrations stopped. In another form of nonviolent opposition, and part of my talk is to give you an idea of the range and scope of the nonviolent means that the Palestinians are employing right now. The Palestinians participated in a case before the International Court of Justice. The issue again was the wall, not the 15% built along the Green Line, but the 85% that deviates from the Green Line. One sometimes hears, and I think we've heard it today, that the UN is dominated by Arab and Muslim countries and so cannot possibly be fair to the state of Israel. But the 15 judges serving on the ICJ that year included judges from the UK, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and the US, and of the 15, only 3 were from Arab or Muslim countries. In its advisory opinion, the ICJ ruled 14-1 that the construction of the wall within the West Bank was contrary to international law, that Israel must immediately cease construction of the wall and must immediately dismantle the existing portions of the wall. The sole dissent came from an American judge, the American judge on the panel, Thomas Bergenthal. Even Judge Bergenthal, however, agreed with the other 14 judges on the ICJ that year that the Israeli settlements in the West Bank violate international law. And because he agreed with that conclusion, he said that if there are any portions of the barrier that are built to protect those settlements, those portions of the barrier are also illegal. That means that even the rerouted version of the Belin barrier is illegal under international law because, remember, the Israeli court said it was built to protect the settlement of Modi'in Elite. After the ICJ advisory opinion, the UN General Assembly met and demanded...
ICJ standing for what?
For the International Court of Justice,
Okay.
the High Court of the UN.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I should have explained
That's
that.
all right.
After the ICJ advisory opinion, the UN General Assembly met and demanded by a vote of 150 to 6 that Israel comply with the opinion. The US and Israel were among the 6 voting against. So virtually the entire international community wants the wall dismantled, and what has happened since? In the 7 years since the opinion was issued in 2004, Israel has doubled the length of the constructed wall. That's partly because the US Congress also took action. Congress passed a resolution deploring the ICJ opinion, saying that the wall, quote, should be a matter of negotiations between the parties, end quote, and warning other countries not to use the opinion to interfere with the peace process. I'll return to this point later because I think it's relevant to why the peace process as presently constituted has, in my opinion, failed. What do they want? Let's turn to that question. What do the Palestinians want? It seemed obvious to me that the villagers in Belin don't want to go cultivate land inside Israel. They just want the barrier removed so that they can cultivate their own land, all of it. No one I spoke to, Christian or Muslim, said they wanted to do away with the state of Israel. Asked what do you want, the answer invariably was some version of, we want to be left alone. We can live with the Israelis as neighbors if they just leave us alone. These anecdotal responses are borne out by survey research, and I don't think I'll go into that because I think all the panelists here agree that by and large the The people of both sides want a two-state solution. Another response we heard was, I will remain here. This is my form of resistance. Because if Israelis fear that the ultimate goal of Palestinians is to take over the entire area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, the Palestinians have the exact same fear, only in reverse. According to a poll conducted just this September, 58% of Palestinians said they think Israel's ultimate goal is to take over the entire area and expel them. And another 19% think Israel intends to annex the West Bank and to not give the Palestinians any political rights. Talk about stereotypes that need to be broken through on both sides. And we need to realize the fears are there on both sides. How have things changed since my visit? When I was there were 622 obstacles to the Palestinian movement placed there by the Israeli government. I learned that in my UN briefing. That's according to, when I say the UN, I mean the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, which I'll refer to as OCHA. That figure of 622 was confirmed by the Central Command of the Israeli Army after detailed cross-checking in a series of joint field trips. So these are all internal obstacles, not the ones on the green line, but internal obstacles. As of September 2011, OCHA revised downward the total to 522. That's definitely an improvement. But
You're talking physical obstacles?
I'm talking roadblocks, gate barriers, earth walls, dug trenches, earth mounds, things that prevent Palestinians from moving within the West Bank back and forth between their own villages. I'm not talking about the obstacles on the green line. But that's the good news. The rest of it, I'm afraid to say, is not good news. Casualties. When I was there, violence on both sides was significantly down. Suicide bombing had ended the year before. Only one Israeli was killed the entire year in 2009 within the state of Israel. 3 were killed in the occupied territories. In 2011, Israeli casualties have tripled. And Palestinian casualties are up also. According to B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, over 100 Palestinians have been killed and some 1,700 injured. Settler violence. Also sharply escalating is settler violence. When I was there, the olive harvest was just concluding, and I heard lots of stories, although I didn't witness any of this, of Palestinians being harmed by Israeli settlers while they were harvesting the olives. Compared to 2009, Israeli settler attacks have almost tripled, and now are occurring on a daily basis. OCHA fact sheets substantiating this figure, and the other figures I will mention are out there on the table. So far this year, some 10,000 Palestinian-owned trees have been vandalized by settlers. Also increasing are house demolitions and evictions, the human aftermath of both of which I witnessed when I was in Israel-Palestine. In the first 6 months of 2011, according to OCHA, almost 5 times as many Palestinian structures have been demolished by Israeli authorities and Palestinians displaced as during the equivalent period of 2010. These are not just houses. These are animal pens, these are wells, these are cisterns, these are mosques, even kindergartens. And the reason that they are demolished is not because their owners or their owners' relatives have done something to harm Israelis, but because they haven't gotten the Israeli-issued building permit that is virtually impossible for Palestinians to get and quite easy for Israeli settlers to get. Settlements. Meanwhile, settlement construction continues. According to Americans for Peace Now, the U.S. counterpart of the Israeli organization Peace Now, 5,000 new housing units have been approved in the past 12 months. And as was mentioned here, there is some concern that next month, 2,300 Palestinians will be moved from their homes in the West Bank and relocated in close proximity to a municipal refuse dump, a site which the World Health Organization has stated is not fit for human habitation, and that's in order to make room for more expanded Israeli settlements. I think I should conclude later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. The question of Israel's isolation, and I wondered if you would discuss why that is, and if you have any ideas, what should be done. Anyone had any thoughts on that subject? Even to define it? My question is no good. I'll just see what our people have come up with. Please comment on the idea of an international area governed by the UN, open to all, Israelis, Palestinians, and Christians, but controlled by an international body.
Well, the original partition plan in 1947, Jerusalem was to be designated as such. And my guess is that at some point such a concept will once again be brought up. Unfortunately, the history of the United Nations' control of an international space has not proven to be very successful. The Suez Canal is a great example of that. When the United Nations controlled the Suez Canal, all that needed to happen was for Nasser, who was president of Egypt at the time, to ask them to leave, and it opened the door for the 1956 attack on Israel. So the United Nations has not a history.
He asked them to leave and they left.
And they left, yeah. The United Nations does not have a strong, there's a presence there. If you go up along the borders, particularly you see up along the borders with Lebanon, you'll see, and the right where Israel borders the Arab towns on the other side. There are United Nations forces there that serve as part of an international peacekeeping force that's been there for some time. So I would just say that internationalization, particularly of areas of East Jerusalem, which may come into discussion, may be part of the solution. History has not shown it to be very effective.
All right, does anyone have a different opinion?
Yeah, I understand from reading about some peace proposals that were discussed during between 2006 and 2008. I understand that there were talks, as many as 36 talks between Abbas and Weltner on the Israeli and Palestinian side. Just recently, there was an article in Haaretz by Bernard Abishai, and also a review of a book which Condoleezza Rice has written. Both of them said there was some serious peace talks in the period 2006 to 2008, and one of the suggestions there, and I believe it was proposed by Prime Minister Obama, is that the Holy City, not all of East Jerusalem, not West Jerusalem, but a very small part where the most religious significant sites are located, that be internationalized. Not necessarily controlled by the United Nations, but by a force that would have representatives from a number of different countries. It would not include Israeli forces. That would be a necessity. And I would think that would be quite a good proposal.
Okay, here's one that is very interesting. David and Dennis, how did your trip change you or your congregations? Either one. Why don't you go first, Dennis?
Well, it changed me in the sense that I came home with a new sense of the complexity of opinion in Israel. And because quite often I think our media portrays both sides of that issue as a big block of opinion. And of course, that creates a kind of daunting task, trying to understand it. It looks as if both sides are intransigent from this point of view. Now that to be not the case at all. There's a very robust peace movement going on both sides of the separation wall. And that was wonderful. The other thing, and I think is probably is as important, is that it was an experience of being able to go to step into the cauldron of a conflict with people that I care about and know, and learn to trust each other enough to really start to talk about it. And that, I think, is a crucial step in the whole peace process, is to lean into those, into those discussions that we may have resisted in the past.
Is this the first thing your two, the church and temple have done together?
No, we actually have a very long history of partnership and covenant together. It goes back to the very beginnings of Temple Emmanuel. The Thanksgiving evening service that we now have as a community service was actually shared between Old North and Temple Emmanuel for more than 40 years. The Ministerial Association of Town asked that we kind of gift the service to the community, which we've done, but nothing like this has taken place. We actually continue to share a yearly pulpit exchange, where Dennis will come and preach at my temple on a Friday night, as his predecessors have done, and I deliver the sermon on a Sunday morning. So we have a relationship that this was built upon. And Dennis mentions that a very robust political discussion. Israelis are extremely involved in their politics. The average Israeli reads 3 daily newspapers a day. And you can find, Susan mentioned Haaretz, the far left-leaning paper, which is the one to read as well. And you can move along the political spectrum of newspapers, Hamari, Yediot Achronot, even Jerusalem Post. There's a very vibrant discussion, as you would expect, in a full democracy that Israel has. That's one reason why I shy away from inserting myself into the discussion of internal Israeli policy. It's very easy to criticize Israel as a Jew sitting safely in Marblehead in a place that allows me to share in discussions such as this. And it's a different reality when you're sitting in the midst of that. How did it change me? I would say spiritually, but the depth of my spiritual experience was really affected by sharing that. I've led lots of trips to Israel with Jewish groups, but sharing in moments such as the Jordan River, where, according to the New Testament, John the Baptist baptized Jesus, and watching my friends go down to the river to share in a moment with the water. It's not something I could share religiously, but it was something that I could experience and could broaden my own sense of what it means to be a spiritual person and finding our roots. So I would say that in that way, more in the spiritual dimension, I was changed, more so than my political awareness necessarily.
Evan, you were changed?
Yeah, well, I can't speak to how they were changed, but I'd like to speak to the idea of the involvement of Israelis in the political process. My sense is that, yes, it's true, there is a very robust political discussion going on in Israel, and there are many points of view. I have a couple of experiences which really speak to me to some of the painful loss of internal soul in the Israeli community. I was flying on an airplane coming back. I had been to the city of Lod. Lod is a very, very poor, I don't know if you've ever been to Lod, very poor community in Israel. We had gone to a demonstration on behalf of the Bedouin community. The Israeli government had changed its policy this year to mow down unregistered communities that the Bedouins had built. And the Bedouin communities had been allowed since 1948 to move about Israel and set up these communities. They changed their policy this year. And there were people coming to Lod to demonstrate on their behalf of these people who were being restricted. And I'm sitting on a plane with this Israeli fellow. You get very close to people with an airplane. And he said to me, "You were in Lod?" He said, "I lived in Tel Aviv. I've never been to Lod. I would never go to Lod. But I saw the demonstrations on television." He said, "I was very excited that there were people who actually We're supporting the Bedouins. Though I can't go there as a Jewish Israeli, it's too painful for me to participate and see that. I said to him, had you ever been to the wall? Had you ever gone through a checkpoint? He said, well, I'm not allowed. He said, so no, I would not go through the checkpoint. And to speak to your point, from his perspective as an Israeli, this is just an average guy I meet on the plane, it was too painful a thought to imagine what that experience would be like, having been a son of the Holocaust. That here he was imagining what it would be like to pass through the checkpoint and didn't want that experience. So this is part of what I'm encountering as I move about the country, that there are lots of people who have political ideas, who have a sense of what they think is just or unjust, but it is too painful even for them to imagine the experience.
Okay, somebody had the idea. Would you share each one of you very briefly, one unforgettable moment from your trip? An image or an encounter that do you have one? Go ahead.
I have one. It's the experience of trying to make conversation with a young Palestinian woman whom I had met at lunch. And she was 16 years old, and I was searching for things that we could talk about. And I came up with sports, which she was very interested in, and I began to talk about my experience of swimming, and her face just changed. And I said something, realizing that she couldn't go to Gaza, because she wanted to go to Gaza. But I thought about the Dead Sea, which I didn't visit. But I said, well, surely you can go to the Dead Sea. And she said, no, as a Palestinian, I cannot go to the Dead Sea. When I got home, I looked at the map, and I saw that there's a Dead Sea coastline that's along Israel, and there's also a Dead Sea coastline that's along the West Bank. And most of the Dead Sea coastline in the West Bank is actually in the county of Bethlehem, where I had been visiting with this woman, and I thought, why can't she get there? Then I saw and say the coastline's about this long, there's a little Israeli settlement here, and then another little Israeli settlement down there. And I researched this issue with Bet Selam, and I learned that those two tiny settlements control the entire Dead Sea coastline. And then I saw a little line on the UN map it's a road, going to the coastline, and I saw it turn blue at one point. And I looked in the key, and it says blue means forbidden or restricted for Palestinian use. And then I saw a big red checkpoint sign. So that's why the settlements are so bad. These settlements are not along the Green Line. They're not anywhere near Israel. They're far in the West Bank. And there's just this tiny little two settlements, but they're controlling this entire coastline. So that somebody who lives over here in a Palestinian city, Bet Jala is actually where I was, it's near Bethlehem, could not make that drive with her family, even for a picnic. And that connects with organizations, some of the organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace or Code Pink, who have pointed out that one of the products that comes from one of those little Israeli settlements uses the mud from the Dead Sea to make a beauty product, which they sell. And I haven't seen it, but I understand it's labeled Dead Sea Israel. So that's an anecdote, one little conversation with a woman who said she couldn't get somewhere, revealed a whole series of things to me. And I say this because we need to have a sense of urgency. Things are not getting better for the Palestinians. And I agree with the person who said that there's a cauldron there. We've got to all of these efforts, wonderful efforts that I heard on the panel, of bringing people together, helping people see through stereotypes, we've got to push them further, further, further. We need to have a sense of urgency. The status quo cannot stand.
Bob, did you have any memorable moments?
As I mentioned, I brought 4 professors to Bentley. And one of the professors is the chair of the finance department at Al-Quds University, which is located it has an East Jerusalem campus and one just to the side of East Jerusalem in an area called Abu Dis. And Abu Dis is on the West Bank side of the separation barrier. And
So the two are divided by the wall?
Yes.
Okay.
And I arrived on a Monday, and he had expressed a hope that he could actually show me around Jerusalem. And when I arrived, I was told that he hadn't gotten a permit, and therefore he couldn't get into Jerusalem. And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to be leaving on Saturday, and perhaps we could meet again on Friday, because the conference ended on Thursday. And he said he would try. And now this is the chair of the finance department, and he had his dean write a letter on his behalf, and he printed out my emails asking him to show me around. And he presented these with his letters to the Israeli authorities, and he was again denied. And so I met him again on the West Bank side of the area. And he told me with some obvious sadness that he was thinking about immigrating, because he said, why should I subject my family to this situation? He said, I can't, we have no freedom of movement. I can't bring my family to get proper medical attention if the better facilities are on the other side of the wall. I don't think that it's fair to my family to get this, and he had the opportunity to leave. But what I saw as happening is, one is that this situation was creating a kind of brain drain from the Palestinian territories. But more than that, and this gets back to the point that was made earlier by Devin, is that not only could the Palestinians not go to the Israeli side of the wall, but the Israelis can't go to the Palestinian side of the wall. And so one of the other professors told me, that the Israeli professor told me that she had had the opportunity on 2 occasions to go visit the West Bank, because she was friends with Avi Nicholson, the CEO of the Israeli-Palestinian Chamber of Commerce, and so under these special circumstances she was able to get in. But what we're seeing is the kind of grassroots community-to-community, person-to-person dialogue that is so indispensable for finding a way forward is actually almost impossible due to the regulatory situation. And so I feel that situation, that was extremely disappointing to me. There's organizations called Seeds of Peace, in which Israelis and Palestinians are brought over to the United States and they spend a summer together. There's your organization in which you do a similar thing through art. And we all applaud these, and we think this is fabulous. We need this. But ironically, this can't be done in their own country. They have to come to the United States to have this kind of encounter. And so I just felt very saddened to see the look on the face of Professor Bader, because he was so disheartened because he couldn't show me Jerusalem. And then that was so emblematic of the kind of separation that is really, I think, perpetuating an alienation between these two people and hindering serious progress in finding a peaceful solution.
Dennis, a memorable moment?
Well, briefly 2, because there's just so many. One of them addresses what Kevin said about the soul and the spirit. And it was on the Christian Sabbath, taking a tour of the old city of Jerusalem, but sort of going backwards. So instead of going up the Via Dolorosa, which many Christian people make that pilgrimage, winding up the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, we came in the back way and started at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. which is just a remarkable place of Christian devotion, all sliced up into 6 different administrations have this, recognize this holy place, and being quite surprised at my own response to it, which was just this overwhelming sense of unspeakable awe. And I wound up in tears watching the devotion, people streaming through and rubbing little cloths on relic, holy places. And it just struck me, I begin to get a sense of why this land means so much to so many people.
Now,
It's not the
was
soil,
it the
it's the soul.
physical beauty of the building?
No, it's not all that pretty. It's a little cheap. It's really a little kitschy.
It's not like shot, right?
No, it's really a little kitschy. It was all about what it released in people to be there. So that was one. And we then made our way out of Jerusalem and up to the north of Galilee. We visited a kibbutz, which had a remarkable mission, which was to bring Palestinian and Israeli kids, Jewish kids together. They were pretty young kids, and it was just so sort of Occupy Wall Street kind of, granola, progressive, funky kind of stuff. They were doing, environmental stuff with these water treatment things, growing algae and in soda bottles that were all arrayed, and they were kids that were there, were like Jews and Muslims in this, and they were all like under 30. And it really filled me with some hope that maybe once all the old guys die, that there's this vision building of what is possible, and that it might in fact take shape around something other than an age-old narrative about how we don't get along, but how we might have to get along to work out the problem.
Rabbi Meyer.
Israelis and Palestinians are natural partners in business, and they're so much alike. And we've heard that in a few different ways, and that they're both Western in attitude. You never have a woman owning a chain of coffee shops in Gaza, I guarantee you, or certainly in most of the Arab countries. They value higher education. Both have a legacy of being able to bring creative solutions to difficult problems. And as much as the Arab countries hate Israel, they don't love the Palestinians all that much either. And I don't know if you've experienced that in your discussions. Israelis and Palestinians are natural partners. And I think that when we heard about the separation seam and the way it works to separate, it really has, while it has served what it is serving, what its higher purpose was established, was to try to stop the suicide bombing that was devastating, so many innocent people. It has also separated the Israelis and the Palestinians because it is hard to get from one. Israelis are not allowed in the West Bank, so they can't go through unless they have special permission. Workers coming into Israel are hung up at the checkpoints, even though the number of checkpoints is less than a quarter of what they were back in the middle part of the last decade, because the security is better. It's keeping them apart, and they don't know each other. And so some of these efforts, like the ecological greenhouse, kibbutz Ein Shemer that Dennis was mentioning, the Israel-Palestinian Chamber of Commerce, did you know such a thing existed? Of course not. We don't hear about that stuff. Those are, what they're trying to do is break down the walls that really are not knowing each other, and because of that, not trusting each other. And that's why there's kinds of projects. The more we can do, the more we can overcome governments and politicians that are stuck in their narratives of victimization.
Evan, do you have a special moment?
Many, but it's an incredibly intense experience going over there and meeting with people in these dialogues. But my first trip to Israel 2 years ago, I was with my wife and another psychologist, and we were in Bethlehem waiting for Debbie who was meeting with an organization of educators in Bethlehem. And we had just gone to the Church of the Nativity. And it started to rain, and our guest who was showing us around asked if we wanted to go to a coffee house. And while we were in the coffee house, a woman known to them, Marlon, a teacher at the local school, Catholic school in Bethlehem, introduced herself to me and said she had a little boy, a 4-year-old little boy who she didn't understand what his problems were. He was very delayed somehow, and they were frustrated at being able to bring him home. And here they were, 6 kilometers from some of the greatest educational and hospital institutions in the world, and they couldn't get him the care or the evaluation he needed. So David Trimble and I said, could we come back in a few days? Could we organize a conference on his behalf? And the two of us went back and met with the teachers and the parents and the child, and we came up with a plan for him. And he finally was getting the kind of care that was so available, but Israelis, whether they're Muslim or Jewish, can't go across. They can't bring him that care. That's why Debbie and I want so desperately to get back there next month, because we're going to be training guidance counselors to do that. They need that kind of support from us, from people here who are professionals, not to do those evaluations for them, but to bring them the kind of training they need so that they can be self-sufficient and provide care for the kids themselves.
I have a question here about the role of the U.S. and particularly about the Republican unconditional support of Israel. Do you think we are the best person to broker peace, given that our commitment to Israel is absolute and we're not objective? Yes. I mean, it's odd when you think of it, that we're supposedly helping both sides when we're on one side.
Well, this is probably the final concluding statement that I would have made.
Okay, make it to Tom.
So the way, I'm not at all surprised that Abbas has decided to go to the UN. I'm not at all surprised that the negotiations broke down. When I think of a 20-year period during which settlements continue to be built and expand, even though it's clear that the international community thinks that they are illegal and should stop, and a 10-year period during which the wall continues to be built, even though the international community is very clear that it is a violation of international law and the wall should come down. When those two things are continuing in the so-called peace process, there's something very, very wrong with the peace process. And the way I diagnose it is, the peace process consists of putting two people side by side over at a table to look at each other. One is vastly more powerful than the other. And at the head of the table is the United States, who uses its extraordinary power not to even out the playing field between these two unequal people, and not to bring international law to bear, which by definition, everyone is equal before international law, but doesn't do either of those things. Instead, almost always sides with the stronger party, and always at the Security Council, protects the stronger party from the application of international law. So I don't think we even come close as an honest broker.
Does anyone else have a different opinion? Go ahead, Bob.
I just want to say that I think that the United States has a unique potential to serve as a broker, and it could very well play a vital role if there is going to be any serious peace process. But I think, unfortunately, our political system is so dysfunctional currently that opportunity is not available to us. And I just hope that somehow we can find it within ourselves to recognize how important this issue is, and to put our sort of posturing to the side and get down to business, because the United States, more than any other country, actually has the potential to really do very constructive good in helping to mediate between these two sides.
We have a lot of leverage with Israel because of the threat of withholding money, right? But do we have leverage with the Arabs?
Well, actually, in the West Bank, one of the reasons Salam Fayyad, the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister, and that's an important distinction. The PLO remains, according to charter, the official spokesperson of the Palestinians. But the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, the reason that Salam Fayyad was opposed to is the concern that the United States would withdraw its support for the Palestinians. And everywhere you go in the West Bank, whether it's down in Jericho by the Dead Sea, or you go up towards Ramallah, you see signs that basically says, your tax dollars at work, thank you to the American people. In fact, Palestinians receive aid from many Arab nations in addition to the United States. The problem for Salam Fayyad is that the only people who pay their bills on time is the United States. They don't know when they're going to get it from the Arab countries. So yeah, we have a huge stake, and as does Israel, by the way. And if you noted that this past couple of days ago, the Netanyahu government released a huge sum of taxes and fees back into the Palestinian economy, because they also recognize that a strong economic foundation is critical to the stability, what there is for right now.
Would you agree with the statement that the worst enemy to have is someone who has nothing to lose?
If someone knows that they have hope, they're not going to blow themselves up in a pizza parlor with teenagers. That we hear over and over again. If you have hope, and that's why some of these projects, and for me when I see the economic development, and look, market economy is not perfect. We know that very well. But at least it gives people the possibility for building a better future. They're less likely to engage in violence.
What is your opinion of divestment and boycotts as a strategy to bring Israel into compliance with international law?
I am not interested in punishing anyone. I'm not interested in boycotting Israel or boycotting Palestinians or evilizing people. My hope is that we'll learn to cooperate and collaborate with each other. I think that, as Rabbi Meyer said, the idea of cooperation and collaboration on the business level, along with the professor here, is really a very important answer. I think a bigger problem, personally, we haven't even talked about it, is fundamentalism. I think fundamentalism on the part of Christians, Jews, and Muslims is a really important issue that's at the heart of controversy and not allowing people to negotiate. And we haven't even brought that up. I think that's much more important than economic boycotts, is somehow to figure out how to deal with religious zealots on all sides.
I would be in favor of selective boycotts. I would certainly boycott that cosmetic made in the Dead Sea. I have no problem with that. As a former faculty member, I have Tia Kref retirement, and I have a lot of my funds in Tia Kref invested in what's called the Social Choice Fund. And the Social Choice Fund is supposed to have criteria for socially responsible investments. When I found out that they were investing in Caterpillar, which is responsible for most of the house demolition of Palestinian homes and other types of structures, I felt that didn't belong in my social choice portfolio. So yes, I would ask Tia Kref, and I have asked them, to divest themselves from Caterpillar stock.
and I would certainly go along with a boycott of Ahava. A general boycott against Israel, I would not be in favor of.
In terms of economic boycotts, you know, I suppose you could make the argument that at some point they become effective. But if they're aimed at changing the policy of governments, a lot of people have to get hurt before the government comes to its knees. And for that reason, I can't support an economic boycott that victimizes more people.
Let me say that what I'm hearing in general agreement was that if the Palestinians had more to lose and had a hope for the future, that that's the way to go in terms of reducing violence and not by our trying to punish either of those parties. Do you think that's pretty much part of what you're saying?
If they had less to lose.
Less to lose, yes. Well, no, more to lose. If they had a future, if they had schools, if they had land, why would any of us risk what we have? You have to understand that it's desperation that we've got to fight.
And that's what my comment about Rawabi looking down on the village, on the city of Tel Aviv. Someone who's got an investment there is not going to want to fire a rocket and risk, and then risk losing everything. So it's both that, but also the issue of fundamentalism, because the hatred that is not only at the core of the desire to destroy Israel and the rockets coming in from Gaza still, and also the kind of vandalism against Palestinian olive farmers. That type of activity is done by very, very fervent right-wing ideologues. And of course they're punished in the courts, but that's where the violence is coming from. And so fundamentalism, whatever brush you want to paint it with, is a factor that has to be overcome somehow.
Isn't it interesting when I think of fundamentalism, like Christian fundamentalism, has so much hatred, like Christ is going to come back and kill all the non-believers. I always thought he was a nice guy. So there is a lot of hate of the other in every fundamentalist sect, correct? Yes, what were you going to say?
No, that's it.
No, were you going to speak up?
You know, I just want to make a somewhat different point. I think it was 1988. I went to Berlin. I was in West Berlin. I was attending the IMF World Bank annual meeting, which was held there that year. It might have been 89, I think it was 88. It was a very surrealistic kind of experience for me. There was massive protests, and I asked them why were they protesting, and they told me, the protesters themselves, I would go up and I said, why are you protesting? They said, because the IMF and World Bank oppress the third world. And I was there as part of the Indonesia delegation. And they were benefited so much by the IMF and World Bank, and I thought, this is peculiar. But it was so strange, and I actually went through Checkpoint Charlie, so I crossed the Berlin Wall. But that whole experience was very strange and powerful, because it was a small little island of Western civilization closed in behind this wall. And then you went to the other side, and it was quite terrifying, not terrifying, but it was intimidating going through Checkpoint Charlie and so on. And I have to say, the closest thing I've ever experienced to that was being in the West Bank. Because the separation wall, which was spoken of so fully, does have that sense. It's very high, and it's everywhere. And when I was also in Bethlehem, it goes down the middle of streets, so that were two-way streets became one-way streets. Some streets became dead ends. Shops became useless because they were put in little boxes. But it wasn't only that. I also went through a checkpoint in Bethlehem with the Palestinians. I walked through this, and it took me about 2, 2.5 hours to get through the checkpoint. And I could have done it easier, but I wanted to experience what it was like to go through the, you know, as a person, waiting in line, you know, and so forth. And it just seemed to me that to get back to this situation, that it's not boycotts that are going to make a difference. It's just a recognition that this situation is not a sustainable situation. That people can, it's not reasonable to expect that people can live in a country with that much infringements on their personal liberties. Now, I have to stress that I am very much pro-Israel, but I really feel that in my commitment to the safety and the continuation of the state of Israel, that I have to be pro-Palestinian as well, because you can't have. You know, it may be a lame metaphor, but it is like a bird with 2 wings. You can't fly with one wing. You need both wings. And you're not going to have peace with both, without them both being like peace. And that situation that I saw was not sustainable.
Jamal Zakud is the advisor to the Palestinian Prime Minister, and he said to us, there's one important fact to keep in mind about the peace process. Neither side is going away.
Amen.
And that realization that Israel will be there and the Palestinians will be there is the one thing to take for granted. Go from there.
And to Professor,
Nice loud.
to Susan's point about whether or not we can be a partner. We may not be the best partner to the mediator of the process. But if we take seriously, and I as a person of faith certainly take seriously the prophetic tradition that values speaking truth to power, we need to have, the people with the power need to be listening. And if we walk away from the table and are no longer a partner in the process, who's going to speak to the imbalance of power? We may not be doing it yet, but we have to still have hope that we can.
I think all of us here are in agreement that in order for there to be peace in the Middle East, both sides have to be supported. There's no such thing as supporting one without the other. You know, peace studies at Salem State is a really important idea. The idea that we're all here, Artsbridge, that we all are part of this process. We must participate. I think that's the important concept, that this is not an isolated idea that exists in the Middle East. All of us have to be engaged somehow in this process.
Well, let me say that this has been a very peaceful and cooperative meeting, that the 5 of you have been, and the audience has also been very